All right, well, I think I will go ahead and get things started so we have plenty of time. Welcome, everyone. I'm Virginia Ferris. I'm the lead librarian for outreach and engagement for the Special Collections Research Center at NC State University Libraries. And I'll briefly let my two colleagues, Shima and Gwen, say hello and introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shima Hosseini Nasab. I'm an instruction and outreach librarian for special collections at NC State University.
Good afternoon or good morning right there in the middle. It's wonderful to see everybody. I have a little bit of a longer introduction. So my name is Gwen Thayer. I'm the Associate Head and Chief Curator here in Special Collections. And I would like to welcome everybody to this event and personally give out a special thank you to the Culture and Animals Foundation for their ongoing support for this Tom Regan Fellowship. In particular, I'd like to give a shout out to Martin Rowe, who is here, and he has been an incredible partner as we have navigated this whole process for a number of years. Also, a special shout out to Wim de Kock, who we've worked with a lot also in special collections. So welcome. For those of you who don't know, Tom Regan was an internationally recognized scholar who joined the NC State faculty in philosophy in 1967 and served as head of the Department of Philosophy and Religion. His famous 1983 book, The Case for Animal Rights, was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award and is really a definitive work within animal rights scholarship. So after many, many years of distinguished service at NC State, he retired in 2002, and directed the Culture and Animals Foundation, which he and his wife Nancy established in 1985. So we've been offering these Tom Regan Fellowships for a number of years, and I just wanted to mention that in 2025, this year, the libraries and the Culture and Animals Foundation will award one fellowship providing a $5,000 stipend to a qualified applicant for research completed in residence at special collections. And for this year, the fellowship will be offered for the fall. So it would begin after August 25th of this year. Applications are still welcomed. We can receive those until May 30th. So if you have any questions, please email me at gathayer@ncsu.edu. And I believe that Shima and Virginia are putting that link into the chat so you can see a little bit more about how the application process works. So,
if you don't mind, Gwen, I can just interrupt for 1 second to let folks know. Today, if you're tuning in live, our website is experiencing some issues, so the link may work, it may not, but please check back. I think today is just a little bit unusual. And I've also put in the chat just a brief housekeeping note for everyone to please keep your video and microphones muted during the presentations. And any questions you have, put them in the chat. I will save them and share them with the presenters after they finish. And just a reminder that the event today is being recorded and will be published online at a later date. So I'll hand it back to you, Gwen. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Virginia. Yes, the website seems to have burped just momentarily. So if you have any questions about the fellowship, you're always free to email me at gathayer@ncsu.edu, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Okay, so today we are honored and delighted to have our two Tom Regan Fellows from our previous year. I'm going to introduce them both right now. One is Dr. Sarah Scott, and the title of her presentation is The Anti-Vivisection Movement and the Creation of Animal Rights. Sarah Scott is professor of philosophy at Manhattan University, where she teaches and conducts research on ethics and the history of philosophy. This past year, she held a Culture and Animals Foundation Tom Regan Visiting Research Fellowship at NC State, as well as a National Humanities Center Fellowship. Her past projects include several works on the moral philosophy of Martin Buber, including the work Martin Buber creaturely life and social form, as well as articles on women in the history of philosophy. Her current project is a book on the moral philosophy of forgotten 19th century philosopher Frances Power Cobbe, who helped pave the way for women's rights and animal rights. And our second special guest is Kaitlyn Kitchen, and the title of this presentation is Rolling in the Mud, an analysis of the intersections and tensions between women's liberation, animal liberation, and activist methods. Kaitlyn Kitchen is an undergraduate student at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina. They are completing a double major in gender, women's, and sexuality studies and philosophy with a particular interest in animal ethics, feminist philosophy, existentialist philosophy, and gender theory. They were awarded the Tom Regan Fellowship in 2024 and used this research to complete their undergraduate thesis, Rolling in the Mud, an analysis of the intersections and tensions between women's liberation, animal liberation, and activist methods. They are currently the president of the Appalachian State Philosophical Society and Iota Gender Studies Honor Society. Upon graduation, they plan to pursue graduate studies in either GWS or philosophy. So, on that note, I'm delighted to turn it over to our first presenter, which is Dr. Sarah Scott.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. It's wonderful to see you all here. And thank you very much to Gwen for that warm introduction, and to all of the librarians at NC State. This research would not have been possible without your assistance. So I'm really grateful to you, and also to the Culture and Animals Foundation for supporting this work. Okay, let me start to share my screen so that we can have this PowerPoint going. Okay, can everybody see the slideshow okay? Yes, okay, great. So as Gwen mentioned, the current project that I'm working on is on the moral philosophy of Frances Power Cobbe, who was the leader of the anti-vivisection movement in 19th century Britain. And what vivisection is experimentation on live animals. So the movement to limit and prohibit this type of scientific research can really be seen as the first wave of the animal rights movement. So even though I was looking at this research in terms of how it might assist me writing this book on Cobbe, I was really interested in some broader philosophic questions when I went into the archive. So I'm going to share these questions and findings with you. As somebody who's interested in forgotten figures, I was curious how people outside of academia practice philosophy. What I want to argue is that pamphlets and activist materials are forms of philosophic production. So when we look at materials produced by activist groups, such as the groups that Cobbe founded, or groups that, for instance, Kaitlyn might analyze later, like PETA, that these groups are presenting different moral philosophies. But because they're also interested in philosophic education, they're also presenting different moral epistemologies, right? What counts as evidence and testimony and moral knowledge. Second, I was interested in how moral concepts get created and taken up in society. And so one of the big findings that I uncovered was that the concept of torture was very significant for paving the way for animal rights in the 19th century. This is interesting because historians have established that a reconceptualization of torture in the 18th century paved the way for the same thing happened in the 19th century, just using torture for animal rights. Third, I was interested in this connection between women's rights and animal rights. And of course, Kaitlyn will talk more about this, but I'll just say that I uncovered that from the very beginning, the two causes were always linked. They were linked through the concept of torture, but also through Cobbe's theory of heteropathy, which I'll explain in a second. And finally, linking back to what moral philosophers can learn from these different activist groups who I'm arguing have actually been doing moral philosophy for decades now. I was interested in the relationship between ethics, epistemology, and rhetoric. So when we go through the different activist materials and try to tease out their different strategies, we see these ongoing debates, and activists have not yet settled the debate, right? They're still experimenting. And we see tensions between appeals to reason versus to sentiment, if they're targeting children, debates over the use of images, and so forth. And we'll see a little bit of that in the presentations today. All right, let me introduce you to Cobb. So she is a forgotten Anglo-Irish philosopher, born 1822 and died in 1904. She helped to pass important legislation. This includes the Married Women's Property Act, which allowed women to retain their inheritance and their earnings. The 1876 Cruelty Against Animals Act. And let me say that although she advocated for the act, one of the things I uncovered was that it was really this act that led to the birth of the medical lobbying industry. And the medical lobbyists swooped in at the last minute and replaced the bill that Cobb had proposed with an alternative bill. And so the end result was significantly watered down. And to her dying day, she regretted the passage of the bill, lamenting that it had legalized torture of animals. And she also helped to pass the Matrimonial Causes Act, which was an act that allowed women to separate from abusive spouses. She was extremely prolific with over 24 books and over 60 academic essays. She writes in her autobiography that she estimated she had written some 300 anti-vivisection articles and pamphlets. Of course, I haven't uncovered all of these, but the archive does have a fraction of these. She founded and led the world's first anti-vivisection society. So this is the group that became known as the Victoria Street Society. Also the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection, which still exists nowadays as Cruelty Free International. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the concept of torture as this bridge concept between women's rights and animal rights. Here's an excerpt from an article that she wrote called Wife Torture in England, and she attached to this article a draft of the Matrimonial Causes Act, helping to drum up support for its passage. She writes, "I've called this paper English wife torture because I wish to impress my readers with the fact that the familiar term wife beating conveys about as remote a notion of the extremity of the cruelty indicated as when candid and ingenuous vivisectors talk of scratching a newt's tail when they refer to burning alive or dissecting out the nerves of living dogs or torturing 90 cats in one series of experiments." So remember, she's writing at a time in which Punch and Judy is the national street drama. So children are growing up standing on street corners, clapping and cheering and laughing, watching male puppets beat up women and children puppets, right? So there's this major gap in cultural understanding of what domestic abuse actually is. And so she's latching onto this term torture in order to try to shift the perception of the moral harm that is being done. Similarly, there's a misconception about the moral harm of what's being done with animals here. And she's going to argue that people are describing scientific experiments or as pedagogic exercises are actually better understood as acts of torture. I found dozens and dozens of instances of torture being used as the guiding concept. I'll just share 2 of them with you today. Here is a textual example. This is from a British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection pamphlet. Note that this is an activist pamphlet that is producing a philosophic argument, and that there is also an epistemology implicit here, which is that they are assuming that rational debate is the best strategy to use. Okay, so question, has an animal the same rights as a man? Answer, no, but the least of all rights is to be spared the worst of all wrongs. This italicized section is the slogan that Cobb created, and it would be repeated without citing her properly throughout dozens and dozens of materials. Question, if you have the right to kill an animal, how can you say that you have not the right to put it to pain and suffering, which is a lesser thing? Answer, where is the alternative? Vivisectors do both. The real question should be, if I have the right to kill an animal, may I torture it as well? The answer is no. We have given that answer in the case of man by allowing killing in war and in punishment for murder, but stopping the practice of torturing prisoners of war and criminals. Here's another example, so you can see it just as a kind of a guiding concept. This is from another pamphlet also put out by the BUAV. This title of this pamphlet is The Endowment of Torture, Revelations from the Rockefeller Hell. So it's not talking about Rockefeller Hall, but Rockefeller Hell here. And the contents of the pamphlet are 3 affidavits from employees who used to work at the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research that are now testifying as to what they saw actually go on there. Okay, so we see this repeated use of the concept of torture, and this allows lots of metaphors to be used, links to the Inquisition, links to images of hell. So the development of women's rights and animals' rights were linked through these concepts of cruelty and torture and critiques of sovereign and priestly power. And what the concept of torture did was it allowed activists to build the notion of animal rights without needing to assert equality between humans and animals and without needing to take a stance on other uses of animals, as you saw the BUAV do right there. So that means, even though later moral philosophers might take issue with this as the foundation, it's strategically, it was a good gateway, right? You were able to build this concept of animal rights without having to get into some of these thornier issues. And as a gateway foundation, what the concept of torture does is it starts, and this is how it worked with human rights in the 18th century, is it starts to shift the understanding where the animal is no longer property, right? If you can't be tortured, that means that your body belongs to you, and your body has this sacredness and an integrity to it that cannot be violated, as opposed to your body being the property of somebody else. That's how it worked for human rights in the 18th century, and that's how they're starting to use it with animal rights in the 19th century. Okay, with these interesting metaphors, we get the sense that torture used to be done in the name of politics and religion in order to extract secrets, but now it's done in the name of science and medicine in order to extract nature's secrets. Scientists get recast as the new priests and inquisitors that use this religious and political language of sacrifice. Like abusive lords of old, humans seeking to avoid pain and suffering nominate the weak to be their surrogates. So what Cobb and others were doing is they were able to actually recast scientists as these kind of retrograde religious inquisitor-like figures that were led by sentiment, whereas it was the women-led animal rights activists that were actually following enlightened reason and promoting a rights-based framework. The question that Cobb faced, though, was the problem of people just, as I mentioned, simply not recognizing the torture of women and animals and the moral harm that was being done to them. So this led to her developing an interesting moral philosophy. The prevailing moral theory of the time period, and I'm thinking of figures like Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, Charles Darwin, their prevailing view was that human beings were instinctually sympathetic, and that it was this innate sympathy that was the foundation for moral response. Cobb argued that humans are not innately sympathetic, and that instead what is innate is actually heteropathy. Heteropathy is the reverse of sympathy. Instead of identifying with an other and feeling pain when they feel pain and pleasure when they feel pleasure, heteropathy is what she argued was an instinctual aversion and disgust and hatred of otherness. So that when they feel pain, we actually delight in their pain. When they feel pleasure, we feel jealousy and resentment at their pain. So she writes, the earliest reflected emotion is not sympathetic pain with pain, nor yet pleasure with pleasure, but heteropathic resentment against pain and displeasure towards pleasure. Now, of course, she didn't think that we stayed at this level of heteropathy. She just thought that this was what was the fundamental instinct, and that using the power of the rational conscience, that we can develop the virtues of sympathy. But importantly, she thought sympathy was an acquired virtue, a kind of moral progress that was attained. That means that there's different stages of evolution in terms of developing this sympathy. And in her analysis, she thought that before we are able to get to this kind of universal benevolent sympathy for all sentient creatures, there's these different stages. And one of the stages is that she thinks that we tend to identify with the powerful more easily than we identify with the vulnerable, because it makes us feel good to feel like we are one with the powerful. Nobody wants to feel like they're one with the vulnerable. So she has this wonderful quote where she writes that the most tender-hearted of fox hunters and fowlers tell us that they sympathize so much with the hounds that they have no time to feel for the fox. Okay, what does this mean for the recognition of the mistreatment of women and animals? Well, she was concerned that if she started to show evidence of their treatment, that even if, first of all, people might just be oblivious to it because of just pure heteropathy, but even if they had to develop some stages of sympathy, she was concerned that quite frequently the sympathy would be misdirected, right? That so a woman testifies that she's being abused, and instead of she being the recipient of sympathy, instead she's castigated, and it is the perpetrator with all the sympathy is directed towards him. Similarly, you start to show evidence of animal vivisection, and instead of sympathy being directed towards the animals, the sympathy will be redirected to the scientists, and it's, oh, these poor scientists that have to do these terrible deeds. So it's quite tricky. She thought, like, how do I show this evidence when women's testimony isn't believed, animals aren't able to testify? She was concerned, am I going to be triggering heteropathy here? Okay, so the technique that she devised was to avoid all use of sentiment altogether, because she's very suspicious of sympathy, and to try to use testimony that was just completely factual. And interestingly, what she did was to use testimony from the scientists themselves. And she then experimented with lots of different ways of rearranging this testimony in ways that would direct the onlooker to identify with the victim instead of with the perpetrator. So here's a text which is in the archive. It's called The 9 Circles of the Hell of the Innocent, described from the reports of the presiding spirit. So these reports are going to be excerpts from medical textbooks and scientific journals, and the testimony is from the presiding spirits, the scientists themselves that conducted the experiments. Now, the animals don't care about the purpose of the experiment or the results of the experiment. They just care what's being done to them. And so to try to move the onlooker into that perspective, she rearranged the material according to the type of torture that the animal would have experienced. So is it the torture of mangling or poisoning or of starvation? And I'm going to show you just one excerpt here. It's a little bit disturbing. I'm not going to read it out loud. You can decide if you want to look at it or not. Okay, so you can see how when this is stripped away from the rest of the scientific article, that it really highlights the animal's experience here, that this is not science, this is best understood not as scientific research or as a pedagogical demonstration, but that this is actually torture. Other ways that she experimented with reframing the evidence was to organize it not by the type of harm that was done, but by the perpetrator. So here we have the British Vivisectors Directory, and this is really calling attention to the perpetrators. So it's organized by name. So you see on page 26, David Ferrier, he was the first person prosecuted under the Cruelty for Animals Act. You see that it's his name, it's his address. She mentioned whether he was given a license under the act or not, indicating the failures of the act. And in this case, because he was put on trial, the testimony that's included in the Vivisectors Directory is his own testimony that he gave. On page 48, you see the entry for Thomas Henry Huxley, who was a famous scientist of the time period and a friend of Charles Darwin. Again, you see his name, his address, his affiliations, if he has a license. And his testimony, which is actually comes from a medical textbook that he wrote. Okay, so you see these different ways in which Cobb is trying to kind of redirect sympathy. And so I was interested in this, but I also wanted to look at kind of completely alternative modes of philosophic and moral persuasion. So here we have some images. These are from a few decades later coming out of the United States. And what you see, so compare what you just saw from Cobb's work with these types of images, and how are you reacting to seeing the text and the actual description from the scientist's own testimony versus seeing these types of images. So for example, from the sentimentalist approach, you have the woman holding the dog as if it's her baby. You see this little blonde girl holding the pets. And see how there's kind of different moral epistemologies embedded in these two different activist approaches. I also took a look at counter-propaganda. So the medical lobbying industry is, of course, even more powerful now than it was back in Cobb's day. Here's an example of propaganda magazine put out in 2011, which would be put in doctors' offices, called Research Saves. And you see how they're using this kind of sentimentalist trope of the mother and child playing on autism fears. You see on the back of the magazine that they are advocating that scientists go into career day at schools, and that the scientists actually expose children to animal research. So again, this is the targeting of children. I uncovered that these same counter-propaganda organizations have produced children's books, in which it's interesting because the animal rights movement created children's books trying to spread humane treatment of animals, and we see these medical lobbying groups creating children's books trying to convince children of the virtues of animal research. Notice how they are using the superhero figure of the scientists and the perversion of the representation of the research animal. So this is an animal that has been born in captivity, will spend its entire life subjected to research, and will ultimately die at the hands of the scientists. And here the animal is represented as if it is the sidekick of the superhero wearing a little lab coat. So again, there's a counter propaganda targeting children. And so compare this experience of the sentiment, the use of the superhero figure and so forth, to, here's another example. So these are, of course, protest placards of what vivisection actually is. It's not the little cartoon mouse in the lab coat. And you see a warning. This is in the archives from the Animal's Voice magazine. At some point in the magazine's history, they realized that even the animal rights activists themselves were having a hard time looking at the actual evidence. And so they started to insert this warning page before they would show the actual pictures. And what they say actually could have been written by Cobb, even though they're grappling with these same issues decades later. They write, "We will not be a part of the turning away. This is not a game. It is not about putting animals to sleep or euthanizing them. This battle is being fought against real life agony, death, and dying, and it is our moral responsibility to expose what is being concealed, to be animal-centered, not sensitivity-centered. Only by facing the truth can we ever hope to turn this injustice into justice, and this war on animals into peace." So we see this at the war is still being fought, that Cobb helped to launch, and we see this ongoing tension between appeals to reason and to sentiment, and how do we spread awareness in a way which is animal-centered and not sensitivity-centered. All right, thank you very much. I'll stop there and turn it over to Kaitlyn.
Okay, should I just start? Is that okay? Cool. Okay. So kind of like Sarah said, I want to start by thanking the Culture and Animals Foundation for making this happen. I'd also like to thank everyone at the NC State Library, especially those in the special collections, because I know thousands of hours of labor went into cultivating everything. And I really appreciate it. So yeah, I'm gonna share my screen. Hopefully it works. All right, can everyone see that? Cool. Okay. So my presentation is Rolling in the Mud, an analysis of the intersections and tensions between women's liberation, animals liberation, and activist methods. Feminists for Animal Rights, or FAR, was started in the early 1980s by Marty Keel to address the lack of feminist concern from animal rights mobilizations. FAR started around the same time as PETA. However, one of these groups remains active while the other has dissolved. One group has more notoriety while one is largely forgotten. Why is this the case? Through an analysis of PETA's gender politics, as well as FAR's unique structure, this essay explains the different tactics of PETA and FAR and the different responses from feminists regarding their controversial methods of advocacy. More specifically, I show how FAR formulated their organization and how this structure, while morally consistent, is not as profitable as the approach taken by PETA. How does PETA potentially benefit from furthering the divide of these movements? Why is there such a strong push to divide movements into their smallest components rather than bringing them together conceptually in order to fight what may prove to be the same problem? Cool. Okay. Feminists for Animal Rights and the Female-Animal Connection. Marty Keel was driven to start FAR by a realization she had at the 1983 Mobilization for Animals, a nationwide event that kickstarted modern animal rights advocacy and raised awareness of animal rights as a national issue. The West Coast event organization was accredited primarily to men, and it featured a speech from Bob Barker, the host of the game show The Price is Right, whose celebrity status was garnered to legitimize and popularize the movement. However, Barker was also a reputed sexual harasser, a fact that led some women to protest the entire mobilization entirely because of his central position at the event. Several women who attended the event still hissed when he took the stage to object to his centrality. But despite the outcry from female protesters, the event carried on, leaving women to decide between two causes: feminism or animal rights. In response to this logic of forcing women to choose between supporting animal rights at the expense of women's rights, Keel began FAR to address both issues simultaneously. Although many animal rights activists at the time felt that feminist organizations were not doing enough for animal rights, Keel attributed this lack of concern to a lack of support for feminism from pro-animal groups. When framing the connections between women's oppression and animal suppression, Keel used examples of similar methods of patriarchal oppression, as well as an understanding of Descartes' mind-body dualism. Keel posits that women and animals are subject to the same types of violence, the patriarchal violence, which she argues is characterized by, but not limited to, exploitation, rape, and objectification. Keel was also following a current of second-wave cultural feminist thinking that emphasized the value of a shared femininity as a site of empowerment. FAR asserted the biological similarities between women and nature, as well as their similar societal treatment under Western dualistic thinking. Cool. Okay, so on this slide, you'll see a bunch of art from the FAR newsletters that I found in the Animal Rights Archive. In their first newsletter, for example, they write, "Since the exploitation of animals and women derive from the same patriarchal mentality, our struggle is for women as well as animals." This naturalized connection between women and animals is further represented by the art displayed in FAR's materials. Take the following image by Sudhi Rakusen, which was featured in FAR Volume 12 in the year 2000. I'm talking about this one. A woman is seen with a pack of wolves howling at the moon. The woman is standing with non-human animals, highlights their unity, solidarity, and protection of one another. There are numerous art pieces like this from various female-identified artists in FAR's publications that further this identification between women and the natural world. The inclusion of artwork in FAR's overall approach to their newsletter was, and still is, unique for animal rights movements. For example, anyone who was a part of FAR could contribute to the newsletter whatever they felt moved to make. These texts went beyond logical debates and philosophical topics that were prioritized by other animal rights groups. The newsletter encouraged poems, drawings, art, expressions of thoughts and feelings, while still crediting women who were thinking about animal rights and feminism in a more analytical manner. This was a rebuttal to what Keel and others saw as a patriarchal shift in animal rights mobilization, which prioritized logic over compassion, used celebrities and those of higher class to establish credibility, and were organized hierarchically in ways that left the grunt work of organizing to the lower, less recognized, and elite elements of the organization. In order to combat these structural problems, Keel adopted principles of feminist groups. For example, Keel took on the controversial separatist position of radical feminists by not allowing men to join FAR. She argued for the importance of coalition building with groups that had male members, but she wanted to reinforce the importance of women holding positions of power and not dedicating the majority of their energies to fighting oppression within their own social justice group. Keel argued, while organizations with hierarchies and patriarchal quotas may have an easier time growing, they ultimately use one group's oppression to fight another, which is not an effective tactic for lasting change. Although there was a concern regarding slow growth, FAR developed into a larger group with chapters located in multiple areas across North America. Formal positions were given to those who wanted to be more involved in the brainstorming process of the group's journal. However, this was not a requirement. Concerns regarding multifaceted movements from feminist advocates. FAR sought to educate others on how oppression is structured and how the oppression of separate groups share the same root cause. In FAR's journal, the complicated relationship of these movements is highlighted. For example, in the summer of 1991, FAR's editorial desk received a letter from a NOW, which is the National Organization for Women, member who was concerned about FAR's call for animal rights action from feminist advocates. Al Polanco, an active FAR member, immediately called the writer in response. According to this NOW member, feminist organizations were already being stretched too thin, so requesting that women attend another protest was, quote, out of touch. Al Polanco responded to this individual with a deeper understanding of how these two movements are connected and why it is important to protest any injustice when you are able, which was what the original call to action wished to accomplish. The issue of burnout is real, and the writers of FAR acknowledge this fact. However, if group members from one cause have the capacity to protest another injustice, then why shouldn't they? Polanco argued for the importance of understanding what feminist ideology is built upon, which is for her, the theory that women and men should be able to share egalitarian relations, where one is not dominating the other due to sex characteristics. Polanco further explains her analysis of the patriarchal hierarchies that construct our society as granting higher worth to those of higher social class, such as economically well-off white heterosexual men, and deeming uselessness to those of lower importance, such as women, individuals with disabilities, or animals. Polanco emphasizes the importance of removing hierarchies completely, rather than marking animals as less valuable than humans due to a lack of communication, reasoning skills, and other characteristics that are only valued by humans. She argues that animals have inherent value because they can experience suffering. Through FAR's framing, humans, nature, non-human animals, and any other life force on Earth are interconnected and cannot be understood apart from one another. This approach utilized by FAR differs from the framework of PETA, which prioritized a particular method of advocacy. 1 year before the founding of FAR, in 1980, the organization, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, or PETA, was founded by Alex Pacheco and Ingrid Newkirk. When PETA began, it was described by Newkirk as, quote, 5 people in a basement. However, due to the Silver Springs monkey case in 1981, when PETA exposed the abuse of monkeys in the laboratory of neuroscientist Edward Taub, who was subsequently charged with animal cruelty, the group quickly gained notoriety. Although Taub's convictions were ultimately overturned, the first criminal prosecution of a laboratory researcher for animal cruelty became a sensation, It garnered attention from many concerned individuals as well as celebrities, which helped to mobilize the animal rights movement in a way that it had never been seen before. PETA's status as a leader in animal rights advocacy was cemented. Almost a decade later, the group began its infamous campaign against wearing fur, which generated mixed feelings from feminists. Although this was not the first time that animal rights and feminist movements were in tension, it was the first time this tension became broadly discussed outside of academic and activist spheres. And just real quick, that's Alex Pacheco, that's Ingrid Newkirk, and that's also Bob Barker being awarded Vegetarian of the Year by PETA. The I'd Rather Go Naked campaign. In 1990, to protest the fur coats still commonly worn, mostly by women, PETA began one of their most controversial campaigns to date. This was the dawn of I'd rather go naked than wear fur. This campaign featured many famous women and eventually men. One of the most iconic individuals who worked with PETA on this campaign was Pamela Anderson, who is a known model, actress, writer, and now animal rights activist. And if you don't know, that's Pamela Anderson. Billboards, physical protests, pamphlets, and other media were distributed with the I'd Rather Go Naked images. In an interview with The Drum, PETA's Vice President Dan Matthews stated, at the time, charities were known for either doing stuffy dinners or angry protests. I'd Rather Go Naked proved there's a third way of raising awareness, and that way was stylish, sexy, and cool. Alongside this notoriety came criticism, largely by elements of the feminist movement, particularly feminists who were against the use of female nudity, which they saw as a form of sexual objectification. Critiques from feminist organizations came flooding in. Newkirk defended this method of advocacy, stating that sexy is not necessarily sexist, seemingly adopting a stance aligned with pro-sex feminists during the feminist sex wars. Arguably, however, the appropriation of this message to support their measures is a direct reflection of PETA's appropriation of feminist tactics rather than a meaningful connection between the movements. PETA's approach elicited tensions between some feminist and animal rights advocacy groups rather than solidarity. The conversation around sexual liberation and anti-pornography was dominated by figures and organizations like these who, it can be argued, never had women's liberation at heart. Is female nudity empowerment, or is it feeding into the hierarchies that feminists advocate against? FAR's response to the I'd Rather Go Naked campaign. FAR released its response to PETA's campaign in a 1995 article written by twin sisters, Kathleen and Colleen McGuire. They begin by acknowledging PETA's valuable work in the animal rights movement while raising concerns regarding PETA's acceptance of money generated by softcore pornography. The twins emphasized their acceptance of nude women depicting virility and strength, or bare-breasted women who are feeding their offspring in public places. However, the feminists draw the line at the exploitation of women through, and I quote, another tired cheesecake shot of a naked woman flat on her back with a lobotomized come hither look. The message of PETA's campaign is not always clear, they argue, and could be reduced solely to the sexualization of women. The writers ask us to consider the viewers of PETA's billboards more inclusively, which means taking into account those viewers who may be illiterate, whether they're children, adults with physical or intellectual disabilities, those without access to education, or non-native English speakers, as their only definitive perception of these billboards would be the naked women. The same newsletter includes a response to the campaign from Carol Adams. Adams takes a theoretical approach to explain how PETA is perpetuating an epistemology in which the subject comes to understand itself through the objectification of those, whether animals or women, who they can identify as below them. The support for this campaign from female animal advocates as well as female feminist animal advocates is deeply concerning for Adams and reflects enduring and timely issues in the feminist movement. The division between animal rights and feminism is inadequate for undoing oppression, which takes more coalitional thinking. The end of FAR. In the early 2000s, FAR faced multiple issues that brought the group to its end. The first issue was one of naming. Some members felt as though rights language reflected the very hierarchies they intended to dismantle, whereas other members felt that rights language gave a framing to the organization that could be effective in their advocacy. The group decided to rename themselves Feminists for Animal Rights and Ecofeminist Alliance. The change was announced in the 2000 to 2001 newsletter, published after the group returned from a brief hiatus. Subsequently, the group appeared to grow. Change was underway, and discussions within the group were vibrant. Although the group took a hiatus to reposition their stances, their return with new ideas was seemingly mutual. When this newsletter announced these changes and new chapters, it seemed like the group was thriving, yet this was the last of their publications. The core group folded in 2002, with the organization and its branches ceasing communications in, I think, 2011, but I have found conflicting information. Communications between board members reflected a struggle to reach a consensus on heavily contested subjects within the group's framing, such as concerns about the group's relevance to those who are developing more progressive modes of activist thinking. FAR's connection to the oppression of women and animals was built upon their shared experiences under patriarchy. However, feminist conversations were developing the depth of intersectionality and the linking of oppressions. Some board members were following these lines of thinking, while others felt it was important to stick to their unique cause, as FAR was frequently the only animal rights group to highlight connections between sex-based oppression and animal oppression. Questions about inclusion, hierarchies, funding, and other opportunities for the group to stretch one way or another was the demise of the collective. PETA's success. While FAR was declining, however, PETA gained ground. PETA is currently the largest animal welfare organization in the world, with chapters and missions all around the globe. How has PETA managed this while other groups falter and fade? The answer may lie in PETA's relatively uncomplicated and perhaps rigorously unintersectional approach to animal welfare. One example of this is when activists who were connecting feminist issues and animal rights issues proposed concerns to PETA about their use of pro-life arguments in making claims for animals, which can be seen in the bottom right corner. I censored the image. Interested members asked PETA to take an official stance on the issue of abortion. The organization replied with ambiguity, insisting they do not take a stance as an organization, which is the quote you can see on the middle of the slide. However, after the recent repeal of Roe v. Wade and statewide bans and limits on abortion access, as well as efforts to enshrine abortion access into state constitutions, PETA began positioning billboards in battleground states. In states that were pushing anti-abortion legislation, they put up signage that read, "Pro-life, go vegan." In states where abortion protections were more popular, the group put up a contradictory sign that read, "Pro-choice, go vegetarian." This tactic is another example of PETA appropriating a prominent feminist cause for its own interest. This tactic, as the framework of Adams proposes, perpetuates the very hierarchies the organization seeks to fight by uplifting one cause through the subjugation of another. While this tactic might be ideologically short-sighted, it has, in the near term, been profitable. It has undoubtedly benefited the group monetarily, as they're the most well-funded animal rights group in the world. PETA has strengthened numbers, finances, and legislative victories. It has failures, though, in meeting the goal of true liberation for all. The group frequently uses emotional appeals that pander to both feminist and anti-feminist concerns, while simultaneously failing to address feminist concerns raised by members and non-members alike. The harm of PETA's approach. Indeed, while PETA is financially successful, their tactics have proven to be ethically inconsistent. The group has appropriated many social justice causes to support their limited scope, while neglecting to address critiques of the movement's tactics. This problematic approach is detailed in, quote, "Being a Sister at PETA" by Ain Drew, who takes on the organization's resistance to intersectional thinking. In this essay, Drew shares her experience as a Black woman working for PETA. Not only did Drew feel alienated from her own community, but she also dealt with alienation from the animal rights movement. When she was given a job at PETA as a blog editor, it began as a pleasant experience. She had a space where she could highlight the enmeshment of her Black identity and her veganism. However, as her time with PETA continued, she felt a lack of support from the organization. Drew felt like a token to the group, someone who was only there for representation rather than her ideas. There was no tackling of systemic issues for Black Americans from PETA. Overall, Drew argues that the group would rather opt for shock value than foster a deeper understanding of the communities they insincerely engage with. PETA refuses to take a stance on socio-political issues that may be permitted to exist through the same hierarchies that impact the existence of non-human animals. While PETA is largely successful, questions of the ethics of their success are raised due to their lack of participation in movements outside of the animal welfare demonstrations, their usage of shock tactics, and their response to concerns regarding the usage of these methods. This inattention to the formulation of oppression directly harms their own supporters and fosters a hostile environment that alienates potential allies. By ignoring the interconnectedness of systems of oppression, PETA reinforces a narrow, exclusionary approach to activism, one that fails to recognize how other forms of discrimination shape the very industries they oppose. This lack of intersectionality not only weakens their advocacy, but also undermines efforts to build a truly inclusive movement for collective liberation. While PETA's strategies have undoubtedly brought animal rights to mainstream attention, their methods often risk perpetuating the very hierarchies they aim to dismantle. Conversely, FAR's approach offered a different method, one that connects the issues of women's liberation and animal liberation. However, they also help highlight the way in which animal rights groups who extend themselves to human liberation are faced with important considerations concerning the balance between acknowledging other forms of oppression and avoiding burnout. Moving away from hierarchies, dismantling dualistic thinking, and understanding the historical context of movements proves to be an integral part of truly liberatory advocacy. PETA's success may have legislative wins for the animals. However, their division of causes, appropriation of other activist campaigns, and the tensions they intentionally foster may prove to be contradicting the group's mission. PETA's success and FAR's demise reflects a larger issue that has reverberated in social justice spheres. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaitlyn, and thank you, Sarah. Those were incredible presentations. I think we are going to have a very brief period of Q&A. I think, Virginia, are there any questions in the chat that we can move forward on?
Didn't see any questions come through the chat, so I think we can let folks add them now or unmute yourself and raise your hand to share verbally.
Great, let's start with that. Martin has a question. Martin, please go ahead.
Thank you both for that. So one of the, I think both of you interacted at some point when you were staying at NCSU. I would love to hear, because of obviously there are so many connections between your thoughts and ideas spanning a century. It'd be good to know what either of you learned from the research of the other that it sort of affected perhaps the way you approached or thought about or reacted to the research that you were doing.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Martin, for that question. Yeah, it was wonderful being there with Kaitlyn. I definitely learned a lot from being there with her. I have to say also that us being together wasn't just an academic necessity, but it was also an emotional necessity. The material is so difficult to go through that it was very important to have somebody else there to share that experience with. So, I mean, just building off of what Kaitlyn just presented to you guys, I kept seeing over and over again this issue of representation and what types of activist tactics they're going to use. And this question of the activist tactics not just being a question of moral epistemology and what they think is going to be best for the audience, but also this question of avoiding burnout, like Kaitlyn just said, so that even when they're speaking to an internal audience, like the Animal Voice magazine, that they're concerned about showing the images, or even when it's Feminists for Animal Rights or PETA, and they speak externally one way, but they speak internally a slightly different way, and how the same kind of decisions that they have to make about how many images do I show or what truths do I expose or not expose and whatnot, those questions are raised externally, but they're also raised internally. And externally, the question is about kind of fighting one type of ignorance, but internally, the question is about avoiding burnout. So it's not about ignorance, it's about burnout. So Yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, I completely agree with Sarah. Like one of the biggest things we talked about was just avoiding burnout with the project. I've been working on this same project for about a year now, and it doesn't get easier to see those images ever. And also just seeing how long this fight has spanned and just the history of it has been really beneficial, but at the same time, it's really heartbreaking because so many of these questions are the same questions, just repeating over and over and over. And it's like, why are we not making movement? So that was kind of the positioning with my argument, like, why aren't we moving forward? So, yeah.
Thanks, Kaitlyn. Thanks, Sarah. Those are really interesting responses. I have sort of a bit of a segue follow-up from Katja Burns, which is, Kaitlyn, can you please speak about patriarchy and the animal welfare rights movement today?
Yeah, I would absolutely love to. I mean, not love to, but love to. The reason why I came up with this question in the first place was I've been working with animal rights and animal liberation since I was like 12 years old. And one of the biggest things I saw was like the specific moves taken by like leaders of PETA or other prominent animal welfare or animal rights organizations. And stuff like that. And some of the posts on PETA's Instagram accounts, you'll have really bizarre comments on them because I mean, it's social media and that's already an interesting space. But I could not understand why people who are already thinking about animal rights aren't thinking about women's liberation or prison abolition or these other causes. And there's just no work to uncover how rigorously connected these issues are because it's not financially beneficial, especially for PETA, a group that's so big. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but that was just something that came up.
Great, thank you. It looks like we have about 3 more minutes. Are there any other questions on anyone's mind? Looking for any. Okay, great. Please go ahead.
Sorry, I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand. Yeah, I was the person who asked that question about talking about patriarchy in the current animal welfare and/or rights movement. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that it might be interesting for everyone to know that there are some movements in other countries that are really actively linking feminism and animal rights. And there's one in India, Kaitlyn, maybe you've seen it, where they did this killer video and then they said, where is your feminism now? So it just might be interesting for maybe Kaitlyn, you know about it, or Sarah, if you want to say anything, if you've seen those things. And it might be interesting to think about linking those up, or I don't know if you've already done that. But anyway, over to you. It's not really a question, but please comment.
Yeah, I know we're almost out of time, but just real quick, through this research, I was trying to find groups that branch these connections in a beneficial way, because we see these connections everywhere, but it's not always done beneficially, like we saw with PETA. And there's this group, they're called NARN, and I've been doing some work with them, Northwest Animal Rights Network. And I actually gave a talk at a meeting for Puget Sound mobilization about bodily autonomy and how bodily autonomy connects to animal rights. And it was this meeting to bridge these two groups that are trying to build a coalition with one another. So like these things are happening and it is great. It's just like uncovering those spheres.
Yeah, so one of the things that I noticed in my research was the difference between the tactics that were used in England versus the tactics that were used in the United States. So for instance, in England, it tended to be slightly more that kind of BUAV style, where it's this rational debate, and they were staging these large public rational debates and so forth, more text-based. And so for the reason when I switched to the materials from the United States, that's where it started to be this heavy emphasis on these sentimental images and the humane education of children. So a completely different strategy here. So again, yeah, different countries and different cultures are using different strategies, but embedded within those different strategies, I think, are also different philosophies and epistemologies.
Thank you, Sarah. There is a quick final question you can probably answer, and that is, Sarah, with so many works, is there a good entry point you would recommend into going further into understanding Cobb's writing and thinking? And as a little additional bit here, we've had a few individuals ask if the two presenters could share their contact email. And if you wish to do that, you can please do so. But Sarah, I'll let you go ahead and see if there's any recommendations on Cobb's writing and thinking.
Yes, so my email is sarah.scott@manhattan.edu. There's very little written about Cobb, so that's why I'm writing this book. There's a few there's her autobiography, and there's a few biographies and later studies, but there really hasn't yet been a study of her as a moral philosopher. And also people have tended to focus on her work for women's rights, with very little attention paid to her work for animal rights. So that's what my book is hoping to change. But if you send me an email, I can give you some other suggestions. Thank you.
Well, I will just give a final thank you so much to Dr. Scott and to Kaitlyn, as well as to the Culture and Animals Foundation. I appreciate everyone who tuned in, and we hope you all have a great rest of your day. Take care.